quick about this project. We are still in the early stages. We have done some analysis and we are thinking of what to do with it. Who am I? I'm a professor in Linköping, work in Oslo as well as a professor at BI or Professor Du. I visited both Mohammed and Stefan previously, so it's nice to be among friends. So I will start with just a specific case to background to then a rather statistical analysis that I will show you that we have done based on data from one of our partners. And I will start with just a picture of the mission of a Swedish manufacturer. And they don't talk so much about being a product manufacturer anymore. Their mission is to drive prosperity through transport and infrastructure solutions. And what do? Well, they sell trucks. That's their main business. Trucks and buses and equipment for, digging and these kind of things. That's what they do. But if we look on, how are they going to do that? It's very much about service. How to drive value comes from what I would call building solutions, increasing the service share, and building a strong service portfolio. That's how they're going to drive their prosperity moving forward. They don't talk about selling products anymore. It's about solution and services. And if we know this company, their share of services now is about 24%, a little bit different between different shares. And what is the target? The target is to build a share of service up to 50% in the next coming years. If they would do it in the same way as they are doing right now, that would mean hiring about 100,000 of employees. But that's not how they're going to do it. Instead, they're going to, of course, use digitalization. So how can you do that? Well, if you're going to you basically double the share of services, they describe in their own annual report that you can do it in two ways. Well, you can sell more products. If you sell more products, you will need more services. Because all new products need some kind of services, usually sold with a lot of digitalization. The other way you can do it is use the installed base that exists today. Basically, the whole service model today is a lot of traditional services. Spare parts, repair, you need to build, or sell advanced services. Or if you would talk the academic language, you would say there is a lot of SSPs, services supporting the products. You need to sell a lot of SSCs, services supporting the customer. And how do you do that? Digitalization. That's how you can scale these things in a really good way. And academically, we talk a lot about this with digital servitization, meaning basically that we build new services or improve existing ones through using a lot of digital technologies. And that's especially when you are in the case of Volvo, where you have diesel engines and will move to electrical engines. There won't be as much of a need for traditional services. There will be much less spare parts. There will be much less downtime. So basically, you need to build the digital services to enhance the value. But what is the problem with this? Well, we have seen traditionally that there is some kind of digitalization paradox, especially when we look upon it from a supplier perspective, that manufacturers invest in digitalization, but they don't usually get the expected revenues that they has hoped for. And this graph comes from Heiko Gebauer and his co-authors, where you, on the x-axis, have how much they have invested in digitalization, and on the y-axis, they have how much it has really increased the revenues. And what you can see is that if it is in the dark side or the lower corner, basically means that the investments haven't achieved the potential they were hoping for. And what does that mean? Well, it usually means one of two things. They have done rather large investments in digitalization, and they probably had high expectations of, quick revenues, that something would happen. If we just invest heavily in digitalization, we will, get new revenues. And this haven't happened yet, I would assume. And this is the backdrop of what we are discussing in our joint research. Because if we look upon all of this research, it goes basically back to there have been quite much investment in services, especially in digitalization, to provide these kind of services, but we struggle to create value for customers. And this seems to be even more so for digital services. And sometimes we can do a lot of fancy analysis, but these fancy analysis can't be translated into profits in the customer's business. Sometimes because, if you improve production, there might, in some markets, there are no market for the customer to sell their, increased product that they have. And research has basically focused on the transformation of the provider, while we now try to say, what happens if we look into the individual provider-customer relationships instead, or even into the customer's business? Because that is where we have to create the value as a supplier. So that is what we try to do. Quite recently, there have been two meta-analyses on the role of servitization and its relation to performance, and one published in iJobM and one in JAMS. And what is interesting to see is that the relationship between servitization and the performance of the firm usually is much stronger when we look on the subjective measures, but when we look on objective performance measures, it still exists, but it is not as strong. And we also see that servitization has a higher effect on performance when you sell more advanced services, or SSCs, instead of the more traditional services. What has happened previously is that some research have started to look into not only have a supplier perspective, but look into a customer and even a dyadic perspective. And here, the Folkman paper from 2017, which both me and Stefan was involved in, suggests that we should actually move into this dyadic perspective. And also the recent meta-analysis by Farasami argue that, well, we know quite much now on the servitization performance link on a business relationship, on the supplier perspective, but we just need to move into the business relationship. That's where we need to go. So that is what we try to do in this research. We kind of reviewed a lot of the papers that exist where they have tried to include more of a customer perspective on servitization. If we look into detail of what kind of data they have used, they either use a supplier perspective, even when they look on it from a customer perspective. They can use students as customers. Usually doesn't work so well for B2B markets. Or there have been, extensive case studies, which of course are great. Both the Folkman, the McDonald, and the Thule papers do a great job. But there are a lack of, how would you say, large-scale studies from a customer perspective on servitization. And that is where we try to do something differently. So what do we do? Well, we cooperated with a manufacturer, and we basically had, in a similar way as what Volvo put in their annual report, how can we create service growth? Well, the customer can buy more services from us, or they can buy more products. Both of them will probably mean that they will buy in the end contribute to service growth. If they would, based on existing research, replace their basic services with more advanced services, or if they would, buy more products, that should probably create service growth in the business relationship. The second assumption we have is that service diffusion will matter. Well, we can either, if we are today buying very advanced services, we can probably, as a customer, buy less advanced services. We can buy similar services as we do today, or we can buy more advanced services. And that will probably have a role for service growth. We also can look into the customer experience we have. If we have a negative customer experience, if we have a neutral customer experience, or if we have a positive customer experience, how will that actually influence, the service growth in the business relationship? So these are the things, the 4 variables that we actually are investigating in our research. So we look into this model, and here is the more academical part of it. We argue that, well, the service portfolio and the installed base can create service growth, and then service diffusion and customer experience can influence how this growth takes place. And what would the existing evidence suggest? It would suggest that both the service portfolio and installed base would have, positive contribution to service growth. So we do this in 3 studies, and the data we got through cooperation with the manufacturer, we got access to 2 databases from 3 different markets from different countries. And so we got a database with all the transactions that all the customers have made for a number of years. And from this database, we could estimate the service growth, the service portfolio. We could look on how the change in the composition of services had changed over the years. We got access to a database with customers, where they have been surveyed, so we could match these 2. So that means that we could get an estimate of customer loyalty. We could estimate the customer experience through looking on the valence of the qualitative statements. And here we used, the work that Mohammed have done quite often, where, you analyze the wordings that the customer use, and then, decide if it's a negative, neutral, or positive experience. And then we could look on the installed base, basically how many machines the different customers owned. So these are the things that we did, and we did this through 3 different studies. So what did we do? In the first study, we got a small sample. So we basically just wanted to see how does the service portfolio contribute to service growth. And based on previous research, we would argue that probably more advanced services would contribute more to service growth than basic services. That is what previous research have said. So we were hoping to replicate that research. Looking into service growth, what we can see from our research is that is exactly what we do. In this case, we are in a growing market. So basically that means that all the customer relationships that we have data on grows. And we can see that growth is quite much higher when we go to service supporting the customer. That's where we will find the digital services. That is where we will find the more advanced services. So basically, we can say on this market, the advanced services contribute to all the growth for the relationship that we have access to. So that was the first thing. It means that we can... Oh, what happened? So what we did then in our second study was that we could look on the other part of the model, where we looked on how does an installed base contribute to service growth, and how does the customer experience influence how this growth is happening. And what do we as a supplier usually want to do when we look into this, or the suppliers or manufacturers that I have been talking to? And they usually focus on the large customers. That is where we can find the growth. That is where we want to develop pretty advanced services. So what happens when we look into this from a business relationship perspective? Well, we can look, the statistics are on the right, but let's look on the left part of the slide, where we have in the bottom, we have the large customers, and there we can see that, you know, growth is a little bit lower. It's not so much growth among the customers that have a large installed base, and the customer experience doesn't seem to matter. For the medium customers, it's a similar pattern. It's a little bit larger growth, but customer experience doesn't matter so much. But for the smaller customers, there is a much higher growth, and growth seems to be happening among the customers that have a pretty bad customer experience. So in one way, the smaller customers, the one with a small installed base, they don't have, I would argue, the resources to get the full usage out of their machines. So they are the ones that actually need to buy the more advanced services, where suppliers actually can provide value. It's based on this, my argument would be that the large customers, they have their resources themselves, and that many of the suppliers don't provide, you know, as good solutions for them to actually create a lot of value in their business. And this is where usually in this customer experience research, we argue that it is good experience that drive growth. But here I would argue it seems to be a different ball game going on. We thought that this was rather interesting results, so we wanted to kind of see what we could do if we could estimate the whole model on one market. And then we were lucky enough to get one market where we had a little bit larger sample, so we could actually look into the whole model of our research. And well, it worked pretty well. Basically, service growth is driven again by both the service portfolio, more advanced services drives growth, and also the smaller installed bases drives, you know, the growth of the service market. Still, service growth much dependent on services supporting the customer. And let's look into the more interesting results, I would say. First, if we look to the left, service portfolio and the service diffusion part, what we can say is that, well, service diffusion can still grow the service portfolio or the business relationship. Even if you have the same portfolio, you can still grow. But it looks still that, you know, if you move to more advanced services, growth is much higher. So consistent with previous research, SSCs drive service growth in the business relationship, but I would argue you can still grow by some of the customers just buying the same services. When we look on this market, we can see that for the large customers, actually the service market is shrinking. They buy less services. When we look on the medium ones, you can see that service, growth is higher, and among the small customers or the ones with a smaller installed bases, service growth is much higher. Here we can see that it looks like it is the neutral customer experience, so not really bad ones, not really good ones, but the ones that are neutral that drives service growth. So in one way, on this market, where we can control for a little more things, it looks like it's not customers that buy themselves out of a bad customer experience, but when they have sufficient customer experience, a decent one, they will invest more heavily into services. What have we learned by this research? Well, we have an empirical study of servitization in business relationships. That is not so common. We especially look from a customer perspective. And what we argue is that service growth is driven by customers with a small installed base. That is a little bit different than at least the manufacturers that I have been working with that always aim to grow the large customers and try to develop advanced services for them. It looks like tailored digital services for the ones with small installed bases that don't have the resources themselves seem to be a better strategy. Service growth is driven by customers investing in service supporting the customer. That means advanced services. And that when you have a small installed base, you seem to invest in services also to improve the customer experience. As long as it's good enough, you will invest more in it. If you have a good customer experience, it probably is that you already have matched the services you have to the installed base you have. And then it is the customers that buy more advanced services that actually drive service growth. You can still grow the service business for a customer even by making them buy less advanced services, but it is a much harder road to walk. Well, that is what I have to say for now, I think.